Hi, folks. Welcome to another episode of Film Study. This is Ken McCusick. We're here to continue our expectations series where we look at one offensive and one defensive player with a local analyst. In this case, a New York analyst, because that's where Dev Panchwal lives now. Dev, how you doing?
Good, Ken. Thanks for teeing it up that way. I'm still not used to the New York part, but it's very true. I'm not local anymore. Miss the area very much. Miss seeing you at times. We had some in-studio opportunities, but that being said, this is a nice substitute. So thanks for making time for this.
Yeah, this is since COVID. It's like this is an in-studio appearance for us. Is whenever we get to go face to face like this, and we have that available to us. Even though you folks out there can't see it, even when you're watching YouTube, you will only get a audio recording. Two players today, a couple good ones that we want to talk about. Zay Flowers, newly drafted wide receiver, and Trayvon Mullen, kind of a retread that the Ravens have picked up off the scrap heap. We'll talk a little bit about him, but let's start with Zay Flowers, the Ravens' #1 draft pick. So, Dev, how were when you saw his name come up on draft night? What were you thinking?
I was ecstatic. I didn't make I didn't hide my happiness for the pick. I think a week prior or so, I'm going to say a week or two prior. Well, no, a week prior, I had a tweet on my Twitter account, something along the lines of who do I think the Ravens will take and who do I want the Ravens to take? And I think I predicted that they would take the corner from Maryland, and I don't know why I'm blanking on his name just off the top of my head, but yeah. But then Zay was the guy I wanted them to take. So for me, it was this is a guy I've been trumpeting since early in the off season, as far as the draft season is concerned, or the prior to the draft. And normally, Ken, I do read up and do research and all these things, prepare for the draft a lot more than I have. This year, I didn't do as much work, but Zay is one of the few guys that I actually paid attention to, and I love his game. So yeah, I was ecstatic when they announced him for the Ravens.
I'm sorry, we have had our typical one mute error per show that comes up. But yeah, I was excited about the Flowers pick as well after it happened. And that was kind of muted, just like my volume was there for a moment, because the guy I really wanted was Emmanuel Forbes. He was, of course, taken number 16 by Washington. Sure. Fantastic corner, just a new Marcus Peters to bring onto the scene at a very weak position. And the Ravens went out and they got Flowers. I've warmed even more to the pick since that night, because I think that Bateman's injury is apparently, still in progress, and they may not have him for the start of the season. And Flowers is exactly what they need in terms of taking the top off the defense for a team that relies heavily on tight ends and an older receiver like Beckham.
Yeah, that's a great point. As far as the injury protection, at the time I didn't really. It wasn't as much of a concern for the sake of it. And Banks was the corner I was blanking on. I'm like, wow, how did I blank on Banks? But yeah, I just love Flowers' game. And I think more than anything, Ken, I look at receivers in the past. I've always tried to kind of project how they might fit with the Ravens in terms of their on-the-field ability. I just love his mentality. I love the edge, the juice he plays with. And the energy, I think, is unique to who they've had in the past, give or take, right? I think that it's not been a favorable spot for receivers. Let's be honest. The fact that he invited and welcomed and I think genuinely after the fact had said how much he wanted to play here with Lamar. So those things came out after the fact, but before that, he's a guy that plays with an edge. He's physical. He'll go get the football. His size really isn't a factor for the way he plays the game. So those things really drew me in pre-draft. And I just thought his fit, his mentality is what they needed. The interesting thing, though, is I thought he would be gone before that pick. I think there was some rumors or projections to the Patriots that I think it was the 12th pick, even as high as the 12th pick, which really surprised me. I didn't think he would be the first receiver taken. I think so. That was one team that I thought could swoop in on him. And then you look at the Chargers. I thought that could be a natural fit even right before the Ravens picked. So to your point, though, it is an underrated element that Bateman, and with his injury progress or his recovery and Beckham's history.
Yeah, with Beckham's history, with Aguilar's history, there's not a whole lot of guaranteed health in that group, certainly given the age and whatnot. But more than that, Flowers is not really a replacement for Bateman 1-for-1. Flowers I'd see as more of a Z, and not an X. In fact, the Ravens don't have really another pure X. They may put Aguilar there, or they may put OBJ there for some snaps, but they don't really have another guy who's a a quality X receiver that they would like to put up there that really matches up well size wise. They're going to have to find ways for him to release off the line of scrimmage. I think that's going to be one of the keys in terms of how they use him. But one of the things that I think everybody is struck by is his suddenness as an athlete. Remarkable, ability to stop on a dime. To me, and this is exciting news. This is good news. This is not bad news. I'll get to that in a moment. I don't think he's as good a route runner nearly as he is as a sudden athlete.
Mm-hmm. The nuances of the route running. Yeah, I could see that. And maybe I know he was in a not very sophisticated offense to start with, right? And the quarterback play was abysmal. And so those could be contributing elements to why he's not quite there. Like, for example, Bateman, I thought when they drafted him, exceptionally polished route runner. He was already a craftsman. He understood how to not only get off the release, but he read where the spacing was. He would be able to adjust to the bodies on the field from a leverage perspective. So I can kind of see what you're saying. He start is the only person that came to my head was Derek Mason, a younger Derek Mason, kind of like just in and out of his cuts.
That's a good one. I mean, the analogy I'm going to make is a little different because you're right. The spacing, adapting the bodies, finding that spot on the field, that's all very important, by the way. And, bodying up against a player is important if a player like Flowers really were in a position to do that. Flowers is going to mostly live off the separation he can get at the top of the stem in the NFL. NFL cornerbacks are, of course, pretty crafty at reading the leverage of the receiver and being able to figure out what's going on, mirroring effectively, much better than college corners do. What Flowers hopefully will learn, and seeing him work with Lamar and Beckham right off the bat is just great news for this, is throwing the wiggle and reading the leverage at the top of the stem. Because I think, if he can get away with somebody with just a quick whip move where he might be able to do that out of the slot, and there's very few people who can keep up with that anyway, even for receivers who are more sudden than they are fast. Wes Welker or somebody like that you might think back to. But in Flowers' case, he's more like a Dafe or other great pass rushers, and maybe don't put Owe in this category because his get off is not at the right point. But the receiver is going to react to his first movement. Sorry, the corner is going to react to his first movement and overreact to it in such a way that I think he's going to be just a very naturally able to set up these corners and get separation that's much more than we've seen from a lot before. The guy, if you go back in years, Torrey Smith, maybe a guy who he could pair with in terms of ability at the top of the route.
It's good. Yeah, that's interesting. I think Torrey did a good job, and I'm trying to think of what, to your point, as far as the fact that he's already got a built-in weapon, right? Mm-hmm. Because of the way the corners are going to play him based on his speed and his ability, so that speed is already a built-in weapon, and for him to get free just off of that, but then incorporate, like you said, that second move. Odell Beckham's an interesting guy even to emulate, I think. Although we don't think of him necessarily as that traditional speed guy. I think he is explosive. He does a really good job of setting corners up, setting up the defensive player he's going up against very well. He's very crafty, and he's evolved into more of a possession guy. So I think, just working with a guy like that, having him tutor you or mentor you, I think But to your point, this is a special ability physically that he already brings to the table. And if he can learn even enough, right, to develop the route running just enough, the sky's the limit because he's got all the physical ability anyway.
It's almost unfortunate that Beckham came into the league making the kind of iconic one-handed catch that he did, and people remember that about his rookie year. But the thing about Beckham when he was drafted is he was by far the best route runner that class. And in fact, in the last decade in the NFL, I don't think there are 5 guys who are legitimately better route runners. Now, I'm actually a little bit down on Beckham for this season in terms of what I think his production will be because he's coming off the injury, and my center of gravity on where I think he'll end up with in terms of yards and touchdowns and whatnot is lower than what other people tend to think. But I do think he can have a tremendous positive impact on Flowers because the things he can't do anymore in terms of setting up a receiver, he can probably teach Zay to do.
Exactly. Yeah. It's almost as if he's got this mold of clay you can kind of look at and say, all right, well, here's incorporating this sudden jab step or doing this and that, right? And the cool thing is that I think I think on the surface at least, Zay's in a good environment because you have a Beckham who really is, as you said, one of the most proficient route runners still in the game, I think. But then you've got a guy like Bateman who coming out of college really understood it. He had a lot of tools in the toolbox for his release. And I think, again, I'm not in the building, so I don't know, but Keith Williams is really a strong coach when it comes to those things, right?
Yes.
The technique, the technical element. And I think he helped shore up Bateman's release a little bit. There was an issue, I think, with him putting his back foot, I think, too far back on his release. So those little nuances, it's like having all of those pieces at play, right? It's a great place for Zay to be.
Yeah, that's a great point you make about Williams because he's extremely technical. So when the two Martin and Williams both had the joint passing game coordinator and receivers coach role, one of the things that was the way they would practice is Martin would be at the line of scrimmage watching the release, and Williams would be downfield watching the top of the stem. And he would be very technical, the way Dallas is with the offensive line in terms of stick your foot in the ground there, stick hard and go. You know, he'd be very specific and technical in terms of his coaching. And I love to see that. And sometimes you really hear it on the field because a coach is loud. Jerry Rosberg, certainly a very loud coach in terms of really hearing what's going on the field. Other times you don't really hear it as much because they're on a massive humanity that's out there. You got fans behind you who are making noise, and it's harder to hear exactly what the coach is saying. But in Williams' case, you could really hear it, and it was very encouraging.
That's right, Ken. You were there, so I totally blanked on that part. But that's great. Really nice context, and just something that popped in my head too. Speaking of Williams, right, because he has a really strong resume of guys he's worked with. One of the guys is Tyreek Hill. If you think of Tyreek Hill coming out of college, right, incredibly explosive and has all those, again, the speed, acceleration, all that is phenomenal. But if you think about Tyreek's game coming out as a pure route runner and having to kind of work on probably those nuances, work on some of those technical details. And I think that's something that Keith Williams helped him do as well. And the same thing with Devontae Adams. Devontae Adams is now one of the best route runners in the game, if not the best route runner in the game. So I think you look at it and you marry the physical ability, you get them to work on cleaning some things up, things that we just don't see with our eyes at all. But to your point, maybe Zay is so incredibly like a jitter, like a water bug, right? Like he's so quick in that short area that he can just win anytime he wants. In the NFL, it's going to be a different ball game. You got better corners, of course, better competition, smaller windows, tighter windows, and the ability to win off the line is extremely difficult. So yeah, he's going to need that. It can't just be based on his incredible physical gifts alone.
Yeah, I agree. And one of the things that showed up in his last year in college is that he was more effective versus zone than man, and that would speak to route running at the top of the stem being not imperfect, and it's obviously guys got the tools. I don't think we need to continue to beat this point to death, but I think it's a great thing that there's room for improvement in his game of this type. He wasn't fantastic statistically at the end of his college career. You see some of those Alabama receivers, Jamar Chase and players like that, and they can be up near 15 yards per carry. I think JSN might have been, a really big number a year ago, not this last year, but the year before. So anyway, Flowers in his final year at Boston College, and again, abysmal quarterback play, but 8.7 yards per target. Not exactly what you want. 62.9% catch rate. And the catch rate I mentioned because he had a lot of short opportunities. So there was a lot of bubble screens run to him. There was some pitch on motion kind of plays, which end up being receptions. And every one of those better be a reception, because if it's not, it probably is going to end up being a fumble.
Sure.
So anyway, you really expect a higher catch rate than that with a player who has a very extreme barbell of a lot of short throws and some longer throws as well. And he didn't work out particularly well in his favor in terms of the yards per target relative to that target distance.
That's interesting. Yeah, and I know his hands are one of the things that he could work on, like one of his shortcomings. I don't, and it would have to be, leaning on all this film that I haven't, quite frankly, watched at Boston College. But is it a concentration issue, or was it just he doesn't have the hands? I think if he could, and so you look at that and you kind of hope that it's a concentration issue more than anything. Was he just trying to get upfield quickly? Was he trying to do too much for his team because they had no other, again, we get back to the offense or the quarterback. The quarterback play, I think, affects the vertical game for sure. I know that there were some lost opportunities just based on bad balls being thrown. So that is something that again, the system, the circumstance could affect those things. I think what you like is he worked through it, never complained, played and was devoted to the team. So those are things I like. But good points, yeah, definitely. I think overall, like if you look at it and what could be something that he needs to work on in his game.
The other thing that is the analogy is right there on the Ravens. It's Mark Andrews. He's got a little Mark Andrews-itis in terms of being over target shared. So for his 3 years at Boston College, he had 20.1% of the targets, 23.4 and 23.8. Mark Andrews was at, I think, 24.4 last year. We just did the two players on Mark Andrews. So I just happened to know it. I've been kind of soapboxing that I think the best thing for Mark Andrews is a reduced target share and obviously a more spread offense that keeps 90% of his real high value targets, but kills off 70% of his bailout and contested catch opportunities. So hopefully Lamar has other players he can throw to under contested catch situations, other first and second reads, and that'll also be helped tremendously if there is a wide receiver who truly draws safety attention. That's going to improve Andrews' chance not to get doubled, not to create interception opportunities for the opponents when Lamar throws to Andrews late.
Yeah, that's actually so interesting that you bring that up, because a few weeks ago I was thinking about Andrews' ability to get a lot less coverage attention in general. And he is, and to the credit of how good he is, I mean, it kind of is akin to the Flacco factor with Bolden, right? Like he's going to throw the ball, Lamar is going to throw the ball to Andrews in those contested situations because he's come through so many times. And he probably will come through, but you don't want an over-reliance on that. And so I do, with what you said, just thinking through, I know these are little guys or smaller guys, but again, I get back to Beckham. He's kind of evolved his game, so he is more of a possession receiver now. If you look at what he did with the Rams, there was a lot of contested catch elements, not necessarily like going up down the field, but there were situations where he had to catch the ball in traffic, where he had to almost like a power forward position himself in front.
Yep.
And he came through for Stafford on third down in those circumstances. He leaned on Beckham in those circumstances. And you look at Zay and surprise, and if you look at Zay's game, again, he will fight for the football. So if you put it up, he will go get the football, and that's the Steve Smith factor. Steve Smith himself has said that.
Mm-hmm.
So he reminds him the most of himself. But it's yeah, those guys can actually, I think, take off some of the pressure for Andrews for the contested catches, and then you have Likely on the other side who can do some of that, and we saw some of that last year.
So Mark Andrews has had effectively the same quarterback for 5 years. Now, admittedly, he did have some of Flacco in 2018, his rookie year, when he had a terrific year. But I just want to read the quarterback ratings for 18 to 22. When they threw to him in 2018, 120.5. When they threw to him in 2019, great year again, 108.3. 2020, 99.3. 2021, 95.0. 9 interceptions, by the way, that year throwing to him. And last year, 88.9. Now, there's a combination of things going on. There's some Tyler Huntley in there, who obviously is not as good, but there's also a lot of Andrews having to make bailout catches with multiple players either draped over him or in the area, being predatory in terms of they're looking for interceptions. So it's not a good situation when you have those kind of target concentrations. And if it were occur organically, I think he could actually have more targets because Flowers is peeling off coverage, and because Monken increases the play count dramatically on offense, both the pass count and the play count, both. So yeah. I think it's possible, but I think the key thing is getting rid of his target share, reducing his target share, so there's fewer of these real marginal plays.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I know you put a lot into the number, the data side of it being that what's the value of throwing to Mark Andrews, right? Like that's an assessment you can make. Like obviously he's their best. Not going into this year, he's been their best receiver in any way, shape, or form. However, like to your point, what the negative of that is the amount of attention the defense can give, and the fact that these other guys on the other side just aren't going to come through. Now, I think with all the other options that Monken will have, I fully expect that you're going to get more value from Andrews in different ways, and I think that there will be an opportunity to keep defenses on their heels more. Which is a big part. Like you could key in on Andrews, and you should key in on Andrews, because if I was the week one, I mean, you're looking at the Texans and the Bengals in week 2, you should still key in on Andrews because that's Lamar's guy until proven otherwise. Is he going to go to his other targets? However, I think if Lamar gets comfortable with everyone else and he gets acclimated to the offense pretty quickly, he's going to tear teams up. I think in no time that are keying in on Andrews too much.
Mm-hmm. Yep, completely agree. Okay, so one of the things we saw from Flowers at Boston College was big yak plays. A lot of that coming back for the ball. Now, one of the models potentially for his rookie season might be Marquise Brown and what he did with the Ravens. I think Flowers it fights for yardage after the catch a lot more, and it comes in multiple ways. I mean, obviously Brown went down a lot and was really very conscious about injuries and taking hits, but Flowers also comes back aggressively for the football and then looks to U-turn and make plays. And I think we're going to see a player, I believe, who is going to be much more aggressive at trying to pile up yak.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the elements that I looked at, and I said the Ravens need this in their offense. In space, the ability to be an artist almost, like creatively, right? Like, going horizontal, making cuts and taking chances. They didn't have anybody on their in that group that could do that. Duvernay was very good and has been good as that orbit, or like the jet sweep guy, and he gets the ball and he gets upfield and they run some stuff for him, but it's all straight line. So I think with Flowers, it's an improvisation ability that is so unique. And the only guys I can think of, I'm not saying that that he's there yet because they are the best of the best, but like Jalen Waddles or those types, you look at what Miami does with those types of receivers, and Hill I talked about, but like their unique ability to just turn a 2-yard play, as you said, into 20 or 30 and immediately puts the defense in a bind. So I think to compare him to Brown, that comparison's been made by quite a bit of folks, I think in the Ravens flock community, or just kind of like between the fans and riders, etc. And yeah, he invites that ability, right, to break tackles and to gain yards after contact. Whereas Brown would at times he'd go to the sideline, he would dive and take a dive. So I agree. It's a missing element. It's also something that I think Monken has kind of alluded to is that it's a big part of his offense, that space guy. And that's also why Ken, I thought Flowers was such a good, like if they were able to draft him, I thought that was a missing piece for sure because of what he offers in space and what Monken could scheme for him and just put the ball in his hand and let him loose.
You got two people who are going to be obviously there's more people than that, but going to be incredibly important in making sure he has a fine rookie year. But you start with Lamar Jackson being a much better quarterback than he had at BC, so that's going to be a very good for him, obviously, no matter what. But
slight upgrade.
Yes, but the other thing is Monken, and I just think he's going to make much more transformative use. And I don't even know who the Boston College offensive coordinator was, but he obviously didn't have a lot to work with at quarterback, so there were limitations on what he could do. And then he didn't have a tremendous amount of talent there in terms of the receiving room, but he did have Zay, and that was obviously a weapon that he continually went with to such a degree that I think there was a diminishing return on his incremental targets, and he had an awful lot. All right. Anything else you want to say about Zay before we move on to what's a good and a great season?
I just think, and we're going to get to probably some of it in the good and great part, okay. So I'll save that. But to me, what I really, I applaud the team, by the way, just for going for him. It would have been safer, I think, to go in the directions we talked about before, like defensive back, cornerback. There were some good talent still on the left on the board at that point, and I liked that they kind of looked at this and said, let's just amplify an area that we don't have quite. And even if, and I know there was some discussion about the number of slot receivers in this draft and how there wasn't, that standout, do everything alpha necessarily, like you said, the X and the Y. But I think ultimately just his element, the explosiveness that he brings is it's so tremendous. I think it's going to pay off. And then hopefully, he has the opportunity here also with a couple of veterans in front of him, including Aguilar, who I think is going to be a lot more involved in this offense and be leaned on than I think some fans are giving credit for. But he's got a great infrastructure. He doesn't have to shoulder the load or be great immediately. So I think that's going to help him too from a developmental perspective.
All right. I got one other thing to say that it's not going to show up in the good or great, so I thought I probably will go to it this year, is that he has a punt return background. And I think he's honestly going to be too valuable to be used in this role. But some of the complete lack of regard for the punt return rules remind me of Ed Reed. I mean, sure. he fielded one punt at the Rutgers 2-yard line. First of all, the old John Madden thing, if it goes beyond the 8-yard line, stand on the 8-yard line, it goes over your head, let it go. And there's a good chance it'll go into the end zone. So he had his own rules for his people. But the punt that he did field at the 2, he returned it 38 yards. And that was all after a roughing the kicker flag had already been thrown on his team. So a lot of bad things could have happened. So I don't really see him in that role, but we probably get to see him at some point this summer out there,
fielding some
kicks and punts. Yeah.
Good anecdote. And well, again, his game lends to that, so it makes sense. He is a punt returner kind of guy, but I'm sure it's a good backup option if they need to go to that well with Duvernay, who is terrific, but had some flubs towards the end of the year, some weird decision making. I think he'll still be fine, but he is in the contract year, so I think that's a nice. Again, that's smart on their part. They probably scope that out and know that they have a backup option, and I wouldn't be surprised if they're in a pinch, like the Ed Reed factor. Hey, we need a home run. Go get one.
That could be. Yeah, that really could be. Duvernay is that kind of a player as well, sure. I think. So I wouldn't say that that's a bad thing. Duvernay and Flowers have one other thing that is a potential area of overlap that I think it's really good that they have both. And that is that there'd be a temptation to use both for gadget plays. Because, I mean, Duvernay did last year. I mean, he won the Cincinnati game in a lot of ways for the Ravens by playing all over the field, in the backfield, jet motion, running the ball, catching the ball. He had great hands for the year. I mean, he had really good catch rate. He had a really low drop rate. He's really pretty much the only Ravens receiver with a low drop rate. Aguilar's one of the worst in recent NFL history. I don't know if you knew that, but
not surprised.
Yeah.
I'm not surprised. It's more of a technicality at that point.
And then a bunch of other play. Beckham is 50% higher, I think, than the league average. So there's other players who were about likely was quite bad. He was about the second worst of all tight ends, and it's almost like the Ravens don't even care if these guys have hands at all. But Bateman, big problem with drops. So hopefully Flowers will come in, and that won't be a central issue that we'll look at. But it certainly was with Marquise Brown, and he had issues with it as well. So he could still be effective, obviously, even if he does. But here's the point I wanted to make about the Duvernay Flowers offset is that I think Flowers is terrifically important to this offense as a lid lifter. And I think you want a lot of his route decisions, route options, the what he is trying to show to the opposing guy more than what he's designed, what the play is designed for, are short, long deals, or deep over and long, or multiple dig and long, all of the possibilities that basically include the possibility of a long route being included, a 9, a post, a deep over, whatever it might be, that would require safety help. The more that there are of those, the better. Well, how does that play into Duvernay? As long as you have another guy who can run your gadget plays and stretch the field horizontally, that's going to make a player like Zay more effective, but it's also going to make a player like Andrews more effective within that grouping, because he gets the help in terms of the horizontal spacing and the help in terms of the vertical spacing. And you don't have to use the same player, because you can't, to do both things.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Because Duvernay can be the decoy underneath, and he can slide the defense left or right, and then you have the vertical ability as well to take the safeties off or occupy the safeties, and which is so interesting, because that is one of the things I had to tell myself almost and remind myself that Zay is his ability vertically to attack a defense, right? Because he has some of his most prominent highlight reels are full of horizontal routes in which he's killing the defense underneath, just on a short cross or something like that, right? And he's got that incredible horizontal ability, but also the vertical ability, and it could come down to what's more important right now, because I think Duvernay has never really fully proven as a vertical guy, despite the speed. He has pure speed, but if you look at his vertical success, it's not necessarily there. If you look at the other two, Bateman and Beckham, I don't think Beckham's quite that guy anymore. And then Bateman has some ability. Aguilar actually has the ability. It's just that, like, to your point, he's also a guy you don't want to rely on. It could come down to that, and just having enough guys that vertically can threaten the defense. And if it is, that's where Flowers' value is most. They may just have to go with that. It's going to be an interesting decision, though, for the coaches in Monken, I think.
Yeah, and I guess they don't have to do it the same way on every play. You can have Duvernay run a deep route as well. But one of the issues with Duvernay, I think you're right about, as being a separating deep receiver, he has more trouble. It's at the top of the stem where that problem is. He just doesn't have that great wiggle to throw the defensive back off. And even though his speed, I think, is probably every bit as good, might even be slightly faster in terms of 40 time at the combine. Doesn't matter that much anymore than Flowers. He just doesn't have that suddenness as an athlete.
That's exactly it, Ken. He's never had it. I kind of try to tell myself he could develop that here, and it's just one of those things. His physical game doesn't lend to it. It's he's more of a straight line guy, and that's why he does well on returns, right? There's one or two cuts, and he's able to go, and he can bowl people over. He just can't get in and out of cuts the way that a guy like Flowers can. And again, that gets back to, that's what they needed. So I think they complement each other pretty well, actually, if anything. And if one of them gets hurt or something to that effect, the other can pick up some of those they can pick up some of the same role.
All right, well, let's move on and talk about what's a good season for this rookie season from Zay Flowers.
So a good season is like, to me, I'm so conservative when it comes to rookies.
That's okay.
So I feel as though even if you get him involved in the offense, so I'm not great with it right now off the top of my head with like snap counts, but basically, let's just say he plays a full season, he's involved in the offense, he plays a certain percentage of snaps, and I think he makes enough impact plays. He's able to stay healthy. I'm giving him a very low bar just because I think that it's hard to, given also that there are other veterans in front of them, right? In front of him. And you have Andrews, and you have Likely, and you have Lamar, who's his own weapon. So you have so many people, right? I think even if you can see progress from him and he plays and he's an active participant, to me, that's a good season, I would say.
Okay, that is a really low bar.
Very low.
I'm not saying that you're wrong by any stretch. I tried to set it at the 60th percentile. Here's what I thought: it plays 14 plus games in a season that's similar to Marquise Brown as a rookie. Now, remember, Marquise was injured as a rookie, so he lost a fair amount of target share out of that, with lots of deep shots sprinkled in, gravitational pull on the safeties that makes others better underneath. So he doesn't have to make all the catches himself. He just has to be drawing safeties off of Mark Andrews, off of Beckham, off of Likely, creating space in the middle of the field where others can make use of it. In the good one, I had gadget usage helps keep opposing defenses honest horizontally as well. I think there will be some gadget use at a minimum for him. I don't think that it'll be all one way or the other with him or Duvernay. And even when there'd be times when Duvernay isn't even on the field, obviously, and then he'd be the only one or he'd be a likely one to do it. There's actually a couple more players on the Ravens, Justice Hill and Keaton Mitchell, who I think would be outstanding, players if Monken finds a larger gadget role for them.
I can see that. Mitchell's really fast today.
Yeah.
I just found that out a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, he's like the fastest guy on the team.
Yeah, it's ridiculous speed. So, but sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
So the rest of this is, I'd expect his own stats to be good, but not incredible. So I'd say 45 catches, about 600 yards. So that's about 13.3 yards per catch, I'm saying, and 8 to 8.5 yards per target. But that's not an extraordinary number. That's really where Brown was as a rookie. But the big thing is that the overall passing offense will take a big step forward in terms of per play efficiency. And I think some of that will be Monken, but some of it also will be the tools Monken has in the box, with Flowers being probably the most significant game changer of the group.
Sure. Yeah. No, I could totally see that, and have an interesting pivot on your point when we get to the great.
Talk great season? Go ahead. Your turn.
Well, it's in a lot of ways what you said for good, I just have for great. So, but I'm not going to steal your thunder, but more or less we see the same thing. But yeah, I think 600 yards or so, and I see if he can if he can be involved in even 4 or 5 plays a game that help either to open up for someone else or he himself makes a big play, right? So to me, that's also the thing that makes him so cool to I think evaluate every week, because I don't think he's the type of guy that has to have like 5 catches for 80 yards to be effective. I think to get the ball in his hands somehow, whether it's a handoff, whether it's like you said, there's a number of ways to get him involved. That's number one. Number two is, what does he do to help the other guys get open? His influence on the field. And so and then I guess you could kind of crunch down on some of the numbers here and there. Like every couple of games, is he able to give you a touchdown? Is he able to give you a big play? So I'm kind of like in this place where, just given who he is, I think he doesn't have to necessarily touch the ball a lot to make an impact, which is very, very cool, but also hard to assess his value. But I think that's where I'm at, like 600 yards, and he's able to make an influence about 3 to 4 plays a game. The Brown comparison is interesting, and I could see that from a numbers perspective. If they, my only thing with that is if they are indeed passing the ball a lot more, which I think we all think they will, and also how do they tight ends get incorporated into that number. So it's a little bit different, and it's harder to pinpoint. But you and I are on the same page, basically. To me, that would be a great season for him if he's able to even do that. And I think one thing I'll throw as a caveat: if we get closer to the postseason and he keeps stacking his influence on the offense, and what does he do at that turn, right? Like he to me is only going to get better. So I think that could also come up.
Okay, so this is literally, you're probably the first person. There's a lot of analysts where I've been almost in lockstep. It's like literally they say it, and I read my thing verbatim, and it's exactly the same. This is not the case with you. You have a lower bar, and I think you're about the only one who's done that of everybody I've talked to. So first of all, I really appreciate that, because once in a while I like to be the optimistic guy and not the Mr. Negative guy. And that's good. But I do have a better comp for him in terms of his rookie season. I think his in terms of his great season, rather. I think a great season, he plays 16 plus games. So I'm saying there's a 20% chance that he plays 16 plus games, or maybe slightly higher than that, because he could play 16 plus and not meet other standards of the great category.
Yep.
But his rookie year looks more like Torrey Smith 2011. So 50 catches, a yards per target of 8.5 to 9.5. I think Torrey was about 8.9 as a rookie, but he had a fairly low catch percentage and something like 16 yards per target. Not saying he has to get all of that. 7+ TDs, and he becomes one of the key players, if not the key player, opposing defenses have to game plan against. And I think that will do so much for the Ravens if that ends up being true, because obviously, when you game plan against a wide receiver, the thing you're game planning with is your safety help. And that's exactly what we're saying we need to get from him is safety help, or perhaps means the only way to contain him is to basically play zone and allow him to have his catches, but minimize the impact of yak and whatnot. But whatever reason they end up game planning for him, I don't see how it could be bad for the Ravens.
That was the AB treatment, is basically keep him harnessed, right? Yeah. And the Ravens did a very good job of that, actually. The way they played him, they tackled him, they made sure to tackle him, to corral him. So you're right. But what does that do for everyone else? How does that open up opportunities elsewhere?
I got a little more in terms of greats. I'm sorry, I want to go back to this in a second. So as the season wears on, he's too valuable to be used as a gadget player. And that role goes to another player, Duvernay, Mitchell, Hill, whoever it might be. And his targets gravitate to longer A dots. I think that is a very big key. If we see a big A dot from him, he's used primarily as a deep threat, or it's, as I said, Mason is the ideal comp in Ravens history, because he ran a lot of hitch routes, but he could make that corner pay with an occasional go route or a stop and go. That would be very painful. And remember the Tennessee playoff game, he scored that first touchdown. Is exactly that sort of a situation. I think the other thing is that his success makes any period without Bateman manageable. And that's also why I'm very bullish on him, is that I think we're going to not see a full season out of Bateman. And unfortunately, I think that's going to mean that the microscope and the game planning is going to be largely on Flowers' shoulders.
That's an interesting point. And that's also something as far as where I was projecting him to be more conservative / lower bar. I also think because of who's in front of him, but it could very well turn out the way you're saying, right? There's a history that suggests that Bateman will not play through the season. There's a history that suggests OBJ might not play through. So those are things to consider for sure. I agree. Aguilar is interestingly the exception to the rule, I think, because he's been healthy. And I think that's one of the reasons why when they did sign him, I was one of the few that was like, I think this is a pretty good move after my initial hate for it. Like the day I could see this. Yeah. So
the sixth round comp pick lost, and you froze there for a second, but I wondered if that was part of the hate for it. That was definitely part of my hate. And then I added hate when we just did the Aguilar expectations thing, and he really had a year you need to flush the toilet on last year in terms of just trying to forget it. 3 years ago with Oakland, he was pretty damn good, over 10 yards per target, which is very rare. It's only happened, I think, 5 times now in Ravens history, with Bateman last year being, it depends on where you set the minimum targets, but with Bateman being the last of them. So he is a legitimate deep threat potentially, but he's also near the bottom in a lot of important metrics, including passer rating throwing to him last year. And, is it all Mac Jones? I'm sure it was some Mac Jones. I'm sure it was some probably scheme that just wasn't perfect for him, probably try to fit him into some role where the Patriots just didn't have the perfect receiver to fill that role. But on the other hand, it was not a very good season. And now, he's a 30-year-old guy roughly who you have to look back 3 years to the last time he was really good. And that always concerns me.
Yeah, those are fair points. I think it's interesting he played well at the beginning of the season. I think it was the first quarter of the season, but then I don't know if that offense, they didn't even really have a system, or Patricia was calling the plays. It's just so bizarre. It's almost like, did they even know, to your point, like, did they even know how the pieces should work together? But anyway, yeah, I think he's definitely on the downside of anything that he's been, which isn't a whole lot, but I love him here in this role. I really do. And I think he does bring a slot component to the offense that the other guys do, but his is that he's purely been slot at times in his career. So that's pretty cool. They can work with that, and I think they'll do a good job with them.
Here's my question for you. If they need him to be the X early in the season, can he do that with Beckham maintaining probably a slot role?
I think they can do it game to game, potentially like flip those roles, but I don't think they can lean on that 100% every single game. But I don't think that's going to happen anyway. I would imagine Monken being, and again, everything that we've heard about him, it's so good with personnel groupings. I think he's used a lot of variations of 3 receivers and things like that, right? So I think that I would imagine they'll flip the roles more. I don't think you could rely on it, but yeah, game specific situations, yeah, I could get with that.
All right, well, great. Let's move on and talk about Trayvon Mullen. Kind of an interesting pickup. Anyway, his 5th season now. He turns 26 in September, so he's still pretty young. And obviously, he's a cousin of Lamar. We don't know how much that played into the signing. I did not know this until recently, but his contract is effectively fully guaranteed. There's a small pro rata per game bonus that's like 152.5, but effectively his contract is fully guaranteed. Now that has implications. Yeah. Because that means the Ravens are almost certainly going to keep him. And I know there are people out there who will hear, well, but Ken, what about sunk cost? Because you always talk about that. It's true, but when you have to fill out a 53-man roster, that 1.08 million has to be then replaced by somebody else. So it's not an easy choice to get rid of that 1.08 when you're so tight in terms of total cap dollars and total cap health, frankly, for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, that's a pretty significant chunk of money, if anything. Mm-hmm. I agree. And then what level of player are you getting to replace him at that cost? So no, I think that's pretty interesting. I didn't realize it was to that extent that they had that much invested in him.
Yeah, so played 2022 for Las Vegas and Dallas. Only played 160 snaps. It's a small sample size, but 137.3 passer rating against him was last year. So what he did play was not good. He did, he's kind of a prototype size corner. He ran 4.46 when he came out of Cincinnati, 6'1.5", 199 at that point. Those were his combine measurements. He listed 6'2", 200 today. He's drafted number 40 overall in one of the early Mayock drafts. I think that might have been the first Mayock draft where they had the 3 first-round picks that include Cleveland Farrell and a couple other guys.
Right.
And Damon Arnett maybe it was that year as well.
Yeah, those guys, all of them flamed out. Yeah. I think. Or was Josh Jacobs, was he a first?
Josh Jacobs. Yeah, he's
the only one that's produced, right, and played well.
Yeah. Yeah, it wasn't a good draft for Mayock, and it was I keep going back to this Farrell pick. It's not our organization. Why should we even care? But he said he tried. He couldn't trade the number 4 pick. And my response to that is you didn't try hard enough. If Farrell's the number 15 player overall, there's a taker out there.
I think the Ravens, I can't remember exactly which pick they had that year, but I liked Farrell for them at that pick. Let's just say that.
And it was the 20s. Yeah.
Yeah. That's where I thought he was going to go. That's how shocking that was. It was perplexing. But yeah, that was a disaster of a draft. That's probably up there. That's got to be up there in recent history in terms of just total hit, swing and miss.
You really do tend to get fired if you have that many consensus busting picks, the way Mayock did in his early tenure with the Raiders, with David Arnett being another obvious one. But Bill Belichick, took Strange. It's not Curtis Strange. What's the guy's name? The center.
Cole Strange.
Cole Strange. Yeah.
Yeah. Offensive line. Yep.
So Cole Strange was an oddball pick for New England, but Bill Belichick has so much, coaching and front office currency in the bank. He's at no risk of getting fired for it. It's like 100%. Him going for 4th and 2 way back when he did. It was the right play. People didn't know it yet in football at the time that was a really solid choice, but he has enough currency in the back that he can say, you know what? Sometimes I'm just right and all of you are wrong. And
you're right. Yeah, no, that makes it even more interesting. And I think they really emphasized guys that tested well, right? I think that all those players had the same profile. They tested very well. I can't remember what Mullen did, but physically,
for starters, he's 446, 6'2", and 200 at corner right there.
Yeah.
You couldn't want anything more in terms of size and speed.
So. Exactly. He's a prototype physically, right? So it doesn't even matter at that point.
Yeah, his arm length of 31 inches doesn't really match his aircraft carrier frame. Some players are a little bit out of proportion like that, and you don't really notice too much. And then other players go slightly in the other direction. Daryl Worley has very long arms and is not much taller than Mullen. I think he might be 6'2" and a little bit. But he also was a lot slower. He was at 464 in terms of speed. So, Trayvon Mullen, they obviously see something they like. They probably see something they can clean up. And when the Ravens do that on the offensive line, I always say, all right, let's see what they can do. John Simpson, I'm interested to see if you can clean up his penalties.
Sure.
I want to know why they can't fix Ben Cleveland, given he's already been in house and he's enormous. What's holding you back from fixing him? But I do think that generally speaking, when they go outside the organization, Sam Mustipher might be a guy who is serviceable for the Ravens when he was not at all serviceable with the Bears.
Yeah, that's a good for sure. And it's interesting you bring that up because I was thinking about that before I joined you. There is a history of corner as well. They like this type of physical makeup. You look at the guy that comes to mind immediately is like Kerry Williams, right? Although that's like an easy one to cherry pick because he was the one that succeeded. It's not always worked out that way, but even Rocky Sin, there's some similar aspects to him and his game and his profile to Mullen. You look at Blue, who they drafted. So there is I would say, a history here. But to your point, going a step further, a corner, whether it's Corey Graham or Corey Ivy or some of these guys that they brought in, and they feel confident that they can fit in their scheme and they can get the most out of them. That is kind of akin to Belichick, right? Like, I'm going to just really accentuate this guy's strengths. And I don't know what happened with Mullen, quite candidly, like in terms of from a coaching and technique perspective, like, was he just a fish out of water the way that he was used? And maybe we'll get into some of that, right, with the other clubs. But ultimately, I do trust their instinct when it comes to saying this type of guy, he's going to succeed. We're going to have him play X amount of snaps. And I that was one of the things that caught my attention when they did acquire him. I thought, this is a good reclamation project because he fits the profile. They know what they're doing here, and they've done a pretty good job. They have pretty good success. Like, I wouldn't say for the NFL, I think they got to be one of the better teams in terms of this, right? One thing I'd actually also bring up back to coaching is Denard Wilson, like one of the best secondary coaches in the NFL. They stole him from Philly, and I think, personally, I don't have any insight. I don't have any inside knowledge on this. I just look at their approach at corner, and I think part of it could be, we'll coach some of these guys up. We're confident in our coaching, and we have a great tandem at safety. So maybe that kind of plays into taking some chances at corner. It's like, I
want to come back to that in just a second, because Wilson is not one of the guys who just obviously is that guy, but it may just be my lack of knowledge in terms of position coaches that is showing up here. But the Ravens certainly have a bunch of guys who are just a bunch of guys. on that third plus outside corner. They've got size, but they've got Daryl Worley, who they had 18 transactions for last year. So they obviously like him to try and keep him around, and they obviously have an understanding with him about where he fits within their system. That he probably has a job at least this year. Stevens, they've said they're moving him back to safety, but I think if need arises, he'll move back to corner again, which probably will not help his development. But he was playing reasonably good at cornerback reasonably well at the end of last year. And all of his grabbiness and penalties were really earlier in the year. I like when DaCosta comes out and is honest about the growth of a player. Like he hadn't really said a whole lot about Patrick Queen, other than, we expect Patrick Queen to grow up and be one of the best linebackers. Well, last year he was finally able to say, we finally saw, some of what we hoped Patrick Queen would be. And I think he said a little bit of that in the postseason conference about Stevens. Kelly is a guy, honestly, he made me shake my head. He wasn't in my top 18 corners. There were some guys still on the board in the 5th round who were, and it was surprising to me that they took him. But they obviously like something about his game. Mm-hmm. Game at his senior season was terrible. His career numbers are not much better in terms of what he did. Very high yards per target in particular. And I would say that we need to avoid evaluator arrogance in terms of trying to see what you think you see on the limited number of plays that you get a chance to watch. So maybe you watch 2 to 4 complete games of a player when you're typically putting together an estimate. And if you're good, you spread those out by PFF and say, let me look at his good games and his bad games as they scored it. And I'll try and see, what were some of the problems and what were some of the good things that happened during those games. But even if you're really attempting to be balanced, you probably end up saying, I see these things in this limited number of plays. Maybe you convince yourself 37.5% of the way through the process that you're seeing this thing. And then, boy, every additional time you see it, you're trying to stack that up in the pile of, I saw that. I think that if you ignore the statistics, and in particular yards per target numbers and quarterback passer rating against cornerbacks, you really are much more likely to fall into that trap. And so that would be the fear I would have. And Kelly, unfortunately, just didn't play very well in college. There could have been reasons for it, but just did not play very well.
Yeah, he's definitely and I agree. I was surprised at the pick as well. When you unpack some of his physical qualities, again, it gets back to some of the things they like and they have favored at that position. And so I thought that was what stood out most for me, is that, okay, well, there's a certain profile that he matches up with. And I think that's what they leaned into, but the results were what they were. So maybe they just fully believe that he comes here and they can get something out of him, or from a developmental perspective. And that's fair. But yeah, it's an interesting group. There's nobody that you feel very confident in that's going to be a solid, like, you trust starting cornerback and just lock that side down. I feel that there will be a lot of rotation and matchup play involved. And that's where Mullen, if he can show up and he can play to his potential, I think he's got a role as much as anybody else, right? I think that it's a great thing. And Worley brought up, and all these guys up and down. I think JD is like, if he can just stay healthy, I think he has I think he has ability physically. Again, we're talking about just, that's it. Like, we don't have anything to go off of other than that. But yeah.
I don't know all that much about Wilson, but I'll say this: if he can get good results out of those 4 guys, Worley, Stevens, Kelly, JAD, you can toss in Pepe in there in the slot because it looks like he might win the role. If he can get good results out of those guys, he's worth his weight in gold. And what I'll say about generally position coaches is, right now the Ravens are entering a very cap constrained environment for the next however long Lamar Jackson is here. They're always going to be short on cap, and every player decision is going to have to be put under the microscope in terms of, can we really afford this player, and how does it affect the cornerstone players we have in terms of keeping them as well? So it's going to be so much tremendous financial pressure on the cap dollars that the one place where the Ravens can get ahead if they want to spend a little bit is on position coaches. I mean, they've always had good coordinators. I wouldn't be fearful that they all of a sudden would fall short there. We have, I think they have had a long history of not having the right guys in the wide receiver coaching space.
Yeah, I agree. That's been the biggest shortcoming. And they then went and got Martin and Williams, and we talked about them earlier. And I think they're both terrific. And I think we'll find out a little bit more on their influence. Some of it's not been their fault, really. So, yeah, but defensively, just them bringing in Smith and bringing in Wilson, it seemed as though they're putting more emphasis on the coaching side. And I don't know if I think what you bring up is a really intriguing angle, right? Like, can we come up with a differentiator from that perspective? Mm-hmm. Like, we have Owe and we have Ajabo as an example. We drafted these guys with premium picks. They need to come through. We're not going to give up on it, and we're going to give them all of the resourcing from a coaching perspective as well. And and the receiver position, you could argue, is the same thing. They drafted the receivers, and they said we need the coaching now to develop these receivers. So it would. And I like, again, Wilson. I only am going off of the things that I've read and just his background with the Eagles, and everything is terrific on paper. So, but he does have, unlike the other position groups like Ajabo and Owe, those guys have talent. We know that these corners, a lot of them are definite like grab bag guys. So,
right.
If he does get something out of them, I think that would be a hell of a job.
Development and rehabilitation guys, all of these are really Worley. Obviously he has a tremendous amount of NFL experience at this point. He's still, I think, 28 years old this year, but he's started, I think, 55 NFL games. So it's not like he doesn't have a lot of experience. He's just it hasn't really worked out anywhere for a long-term basis.
Well, the job he did on Chase, though, wow. Yeah. I mean, if you were to just capture and bottle up those games, especially the season finale, I think it was. Really good.
I thought all three games against Cincinnati, I thought their ability to force Burrow to the outside, play after play after play after play, was really impressive. That they whatever was constantly beating them in the 525-yard game, a lot of that had gone away, and the Bengals had to settle, and they game planned with a lot of short outside passes, which has not typically worked against the Ravens in their history. That's usually a way the Ravens get you. Some teams, can be overly aggressive in the, between the tackles, but it's not really the Ravens' way. They've been pretty good with that. So I thought that that was well done by the defensive coordinator, and by the fact that Burrow really had to take what he's given, even though obviously they won 2 of those 3 games this last year.
Yeah, they did. But they're more of a haymaker, home run type team, right? And that's what they thrive off of. And he's got the guys that can go get the football. But I love the Ravens' physicality against the Bengals. Like, they just didn't. And Worley, I mean, to all that getting back in. I know we're talking about Mullen, but even if you could just show up, and maybe this is something for Mullen as a blueprint, right? If you can just show up and hit and get in these guys' face and not be afraid of them, that will go a long way. Especially in the AFC North, especially with this division, which is a beat you up division. So that's a big part of it.
Yep, absolutely. What else do you need to say about him? Anything? I did have one other thing, unfortunately. One of the things about Mullen that's been very bad his whole career is some of the peripheral statistics: 17.3% missed tackle rate. This isn't really peripheral, but 4.7 yak per reception allowed. 8 and 4 in TDs is not terrible. If you think about a 2-to-1 relationship between touchdowns and interceptions, that's probably typical across the whole league these days. And a 94.3 opposition passer rate is a little high, but not terribly high. But 23 penalties in 1,997 career snaps is on the high side. Yeah. And so it's obviously there's a great deal of things that are not quite at an adequate level for Coach Wilson to get right in on and try and fix. Anything else to say before we move on to good and great?
Yeah, sure. To that point, though, I think what it to me, it just strikes me as like he's 25 years old and he came off of, it's almost like a transfer from college who had 4 years and it was a complete disaster, and now he's coming to Kentucky for so not that the Ravens are Kentucky. I'm just saying that, but I think in house they believe
this is a basketball analogy, right? Not a football analogy.
It's not it's a bad basketball analogy because normally you don't transfer after 4 years. It's just the idea though that I think maybe they're looking at the first. I think it's been 4 years, right? Or 3 years, sorry, in his 2019, 20.
This is his 5th season.
Right. So getting into the 5th season, where he's been, they're just going to chalk it up to maybe he needs to get a change of scenery. We have a good system. We have some good coaching. And I think that could play a part in the fact, to your point about Wilson, right? Like, what does he have to work with? Can he clean these things up? I don't think he's ever going to get to that, whatever his promise was as a 2nd-round pick. But can he get to a functional level? We'll talk more about the predictions, but yeah, I think that's the goal, maybe. Right. But yeah, let's get into it.
Very good. They made a bigger commitment to him than they did to any of the other guys at the bottom. In a sense, they've still got draft capital on Kelly and JD. But go ahead, a good season for you. What does it look like?
Good season is he's on the team the whole season. He's part of he's a part of the depth. I think to your point, there could be some toggling between second, third corner. I mean, you would think Rocky Sin should be the second corner. I just can't rely on that, like as far as from an injury perspective and things like that. But if he's like at least 4th, right, or something to that extent, like he's 4th or 5th between Worley, and he is a reliable guy. He will be asked to jump in at times, maybe start a couple games, but he's a fixture in their depth chart. He's a reliable backup. I think that's pretty good, and I think if he can, he can contribute on special teams as well. I mean, we're not getting too deep into the weeds on that, but yeah, I think I would imagine he has to be a pretty good player on special teams to some extent, and I think that would be a pretty good season for him, all things considered.
I think that's very reasonable, and I was similar, so I'll just read mine directly here. Emerges from a crowded set of cornerback hopefuls as the 4th or 5th outside cornerback behind Yasin Humphrey and another who may be acquired. There's Worley, Stevens, Kelly, JD that are going to be competitors for that 4th and 5th spot, I think. Makes the team initially. If he doesn't, obviously the salary is lost. There's no reason for him to stick around. There's no reason for a handshake deal because he's already earned his money. So the Ravens are have to pick him up again at market value effectively if they let him walk or if they cut him at the end of camp. I think he probably will see some snaps as a 4th or 5th player because injuries occur. It's very natural. You said all this that maybe he starts 2 games. Maybe I think that might be a reasonable number. But that his coverage is near the league average, whatever snaps he gets, and that actually is a pretty big step up. But it is, I guess, if he beats those other guys out, we're already getting a little Bayesian with ourselves in terms of once he's beaten all those guys out, he probably has improved his game, at least to the point where you could expect his actual performance on the field to be better. And so I'm not saying at the league average. I'm not saying above the league average, certainly, is a good season. I'm saying he doesn't kill the Ravens by being a replacement or below replacement corner when he's in there.
Yeah, I agree. And that's the mark of what we're expecting. I mean, again, for what they might expect, can we plug them in for a couple of games confidently? But all of the factors that we talked about, like between pass rush, safety help, they're going to control some of the environment for him or like help him, you would think. And some of that could play into it for him to play to that level. And I think that's a fair point. I think it's a fair assessment, like that they can be confident in him as a reliable replacement option.
Turn it up a notch. What's a great season for him?
Great season. He honestly grabs the starting job. He is a number 2 corner. He's a fixture in the lineup. I think Kerry Williams is the model, to be honest. Like, I don't expect that from Trayvon Mullen. I want people to know before I get tomatoes thrown at me and I get that, I'm comparing him to Kerry Williams. I'm just saying, yeah, there's an opportunity here. I don't think Rocky Sin I like Rocky Sin a lot. I love I really liked the signing. I just don't think he is a set it and forget it guy. I think there is an avenue to be a starter. I think he can turn his career around, Trayvon Mullen. Those things are still available if he's a starting corner. He is somebody they can rely on in man coverage situations, maybe depending on scheme, depending on what they need to do. But he can hold up downfield. He can use his physical tools to bother some of these bully receivers that they might face. Jamar Chase, for example, is a guy they're going to face twice a year. Deontay Johnson, who's I think, very good and is able to get to those contested balls, and you might not think about it, right? But like Pickens is a big dude that is going to be physical. So again, can he do that? Can they confidently rely on him in those circumstances? And I think beyond that, I don't know if he's much of a playmaker. I would just be happy with some good coverage and play more physical than what you said. If he's giving up yards after catch or
missing tackles.
Yeah, is he missing tackles? That can't happen here. Like he's gonna have to clean that. To me, is an area where if they can't clean up everything else, at least give me a guy that's physical, will hit and stick his nose in there. That's what Worley did. For all the stuff we've talked about, like he did that, and so I want to see that from Mullen.
All right, that's a very high bar you've set for Mullen there, and I was going to make a joke about you having, it means I kind of am making a joke that you can't see the screen that I'm seeing of Dev, but his face just turned purple and has a 95 on it, because I think that's about the percentile result you've just described in him taking the number 2 role. It's not impossible. It isn't impossible, and I think some of yours is born of a distrust of Rock Ya-Sin, which I think is probably justified, and I think it's also part of the reason why the Ravens are going to go get another outside corner before they go. But maybe another interesting thing to talk about before I dump into my grade here would be, can the Ravens afford to play defense with 3 outside corners with relatively similar styles? They're not all at the same level. Humphrey's a much better player, obviously, but he uses baseball bat arms. He's not a find the ball in the air guy as much. When he does find the ball in the air, it's usually coming off his man to make a play on the ball. A little bit like Jimmy Smith in some respects like that, but definitely handles the sideline well. I think of Ya-Sin as being that guy. I probably think of Mullen as being that sort of a physical player, though Mullen's had a few interceptions career, 3 or 4. But being a guy who is more physical than he is a ball skills guy. We've been so spoiled by having Marcus Peters here and how well he worked with the fact that the Ravens were setting up pressures with blitzes, with stunts, and getting in the quarterback's face, forcing a throw, and then he knew just what to do with that in terms of jumping around or doing whatever he had to do from the back end to see what was happening.
That's exactly it. His football IQ, his intelligence, his ability to understand circumstance and what he can and can't do based on that, right? Like the backside coverage or the blitz they might have dialed up and how much time he has to jump in. And it's just another level altogether. And I don't know if these guys they're not going to have Marcus Peters' IQ, but even a fraction of that. And can they kind of mix and match in a way where they can compensate for some of it? I think that's a fair question and a fair call out. And we'll see, because part of it is they also have, I think and I get back to this point, I do think that they are looking at the safeties as well as part of this.
Yeah.
Maybe with Peters, like you could say if we have marginal safety play, he can still be relied on to just handle himself on one side of the field. But you flip it the other way and you have more marginal cornerback talent, can these safeties cover up for that? I think it's an interesting dynamic. I could see the arguments for that approach, especially from a cap and resource perspective.
That it's cheaper to get a safety than it is to get a good corner, and so you should. I mean, they've spent a ton of draft capital and a ton of actual cap at the safety position, but they have a remarkable set of safeties at this point in terms of. I really like Geno Stone. I think he can help the team, and one of the questions about that is, do you make the decision on whether or not Geno Stone is on the field based on how much Kyle Hamilton can still help you in the slot? And I think that's where I have to I have to take a step back and say Geno Stone's a fine injury replacement, but the most important decision here is where's Kyle Hamilton going to play and have the highest chance to be a superstar, just because the multiplier on that is so high relative to the payoff could be so high in terms of getting him to the right spot.
Oh, I agree. Yeah, he's an interesting player because he's so good at everything for the most part. So then you have to kind of figure out, like, where's he going to really excel and take off? Mm-hmm. It's not an easy decision. So I'm curious to see what they ultimately decide, or I'm sure they don't have to make it. And Harbaugh always says this, right? It's not a one or it's not a scenario where you just say he's a strong safety. I mean, mm-hmm. they have, and they will play different spots, and it's a little bit more of a hybrid role, and that's what this NFL has turned into. That being said, where does he end up fitting more often than not is one of the questions. That and the Zay Flowers question: where does Zay Flowers fit more often? Like, where is he going to be at? So I love that. I love the question that's open ended.
Let me go back and give a great season for Trayvon Mullen, because I don't want to. The guy needs to get his due here. I'd say makes the team and thrives in the Ravens' defensive structure, and with better players around him and better coaching. Plays between 200 and 500 snaps. That is not going to be a great season for the Baltimore Ravens, by the way, if Trayvon Mullen plays between 200 and 500 snaps, unless you're exactly right and he beats out Rock Ya-Sin.
And he's good.
And he's good.
He's bad. They're all bad.
Plays between 200 and 500 snaps in rotation, and as the need arises due to injury, has his best coverage season to date with an opposing passer rating in the 80s and participation in 2 to 3 turnovers. Missed tackle rate declines to less than 15%. That's a lot of ask. Some of it, if he plays a fair amount, his missed tackle rate better go down to that.
Oh yeah,
that's still pretty high.
Absolutely. So. What we're asking, I think you're lower on him, which is understandable. I'm not saying I'm higher on him. It's just more of a pathway thing, like we talked about. I think there's a path, and the talent is there. So it's a total turnaround of his career and what he's done to this point, which is very optimistic. But it's not to say it hasn't happened in this league. We've seen there are use cases where guys go to the right place and they turn things around and they realize their potential.
Yeah, absolutely. And last year, Roquan Smith was a great example. Honestly, he was a pretty good player for the Bears. Always a great tackler. Piled up tons of tackles. But honestly, hadn't been a great coverage player. He came to the Ravens. He was much better. Hadn't been a game-changing pass rusher. Came to the Ravens, was much better. He just came into a better coached, more secure scheme around him with better players, and that can make all the difference.
I'm a big believer in that, Ken. A lot of the debates that I get into, they're not debates necessarily, but just conversations more so. Mm-hmm. If it does come up on Twitter, it will be around how good or bad a player really is based on the environment and what they could do if they're in the right environment, as opposed to the alternative, which you said. You look at the Raiders. They've just been abysmal, right, in a lot of ways. So it's just hard to really, even with Rock Ya-Sin, right, like he was good on the Raiders for that stretch. So what could he do with a team that is a lot more like functional, and like what are the pieces that are surrounding him, and what could he as much as I said about Rock Ya-Sin, he could even take his game to another level. It's possible.
How do you then use that to turn it around to ask the question of, can we really depend on this receiver who's gotten to work with the Chargers offense, say, and Justin Herbert for these years? And I try to think of a really good quarterback. Joe Burrow doesn't quite have the arm strength that I would, put him in that class, but a guy who plays in a great system with other great receivers and a very good quarterback. Do you ding that guy appropriately in the same way? Saying we're pulling him out of, the adult pool, and we're putting him into this, mud puddle.
I've become better at that than I would say a couple of years ago, where I'm looking at everything as positive. Now, I think you do have to also go the other way and say, can this guy be the go-to receiver? Juju Smith-Schuster is I think the primary example of that, right? Has he been good? Yeah, he's been pretty good. Has he been what he was with the Steelers with Brown? No, right? And it proved itself out when he got what he got. I think he's done pretty well for himself from a contract position, and he's been paid very well. But he's just not that guy. And,
Mhm.
and for a stretch, people thought he could very well be that guy. So yeah, I do think that has to also be considered. And a lot of the things that we're talking about with Mullen, it could very well be up to him. Like it could be because maybe he was in the right situation and he was getting the coaching, and he just didn't. He's just a guy that's not going to work out in this league, and we'll find out. I don't want to make it sound as though that's not a possibility. There's a very good possibility of that. Like it's just,
Yeah.
but yeah,
The Ravens vet people before they come here, whether they're rookies and they have those interviews, or if they're signing somebody, they certainly talk to the player before they, just make an offer sheet to the agent. And they're just a bunch of players out there who can still fool you, and know how to say all the right things. And the guy, if you're an Orioles fan, the guy who fits this mold exactly came to the Orioles 50 years ago in one of the worst trades they ever made, and that's Earl Williams, a guy who, a catcher who Earl Weaver constantly wrote about the book. He devoted about 8 pages in the book. It's what you learn after you know it all that counts. Fantastic book, by the way. Management Text. If you want to give that out at work, it's out of print, but you can still find it on eBay and places like that. But it is about 8 pages on Earl Williams, that it's just the most hilarious stuff you'll ever see in terms of a guy who is just constantly talking about reforming himself and whatnot. And then the next moment he's leaving the hotel right as he's coming in, as Earl's coming in at like 12:30, and they got a day game the next day. So it's just, see some of this stuff go on. So it hopefully in the case of Mullen, he's ready to play this year.
Totally. We hope so. I mean, it could happen. They've got some good track record for that, but let's see. And he could easily also be what he's been. But you don't lose anything. I think you said the financial investment, but I think in the grand scheme, there's a lot of upside.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's good. I think it's probably a good gamble as well. And if he ends up the fourth corner, I think they've won on the gamble. So we'll look and see what happens there. Outstanding. Just so much fun talking football with you, Dev. So much very deep insight on these players. Really appreciate you coming on, taking the time with us. I know it gets more and more difficult as you are a relatively new father, right?
Correct. Yeah. 14 months. So I would say I still fall into the definition of that. But yeah, it's been a great ride, and he's amazing. My son, Krish, and family life. But I think what I enjoy about our conversation is the free forum, and just kind of like we can pivot in all these different directions. Mm-hmm. That's what I can do now, and structure wise, it's tough to commit to things. But when we do get together, I love the fact that we have this wide, expansive conversation. So thank you for having me, and I look forward to talking to you again. Hoping during the season.
Yeah, I hope so too. Deb,
or even before. We'll see.
Sure thing. Tell folks where they can find your work online.
Sure. Everybody that I think I interact with on a consistent level, it's still on Twitter the most. @DevPanchois is my Twitter account and my handle, and I tweet more often than I write these days. However, I would like to plug one of the articles that's near and dear to my heart. I did on Chuck Smith, the Ravens. We talked about coaching, right? The Ravens' new outside linebackers coach, his influence potentially on Ajabo and Owe, and I went into all 3 of them, looked back at last year in terms of what Owe did, and some of the things that I think Smith can help with given his pedigree. So check that out. I have it pinned on my profile. It's my last Russell Street Report article, which I didn't mention at the top, but I also still write for Russell Street Report as well when I guess the inspiration comes to me, just like if Ken sends an invite out, I'll jump on this pod from time to time. So that's where you can find me on Russell Street Report and or Twitter.
Great follow on Twitter. Make sure you follow Dev. He's very active there. And still following the Orioles at all, or are you not really an Orioles fan?
I'm such a disgrace as an Orioles. I am a fan. It's just I've been really bad about baseball in general, and in terms of like my attention going into it. But I am rabidly excited to see what they're doing, and I love the way they built the team up this way, and a lot of the philosophy through the draft and just development wise what they've done, and it's great to see it for the town. I'm not there, but I'm sure it's electric. And I know you go to a lot of their ball games, and so I'm a big fan from afar, and I always will be an Orioles fan. So But I have nothing to contribute on the subject.
Okay, no,
Yeah,
that's fine. I was just wondering if you were still watching.
Yeah.
Twitter is an interesting place, but there's always somebody who wants to trade Jackson Holiday for 3 months of Shohei Ohtani, and or actually 2.5 months at this point. And just I keep shaking my head at it's the same currency is undervalued in both cases, but draft picks for the Ravens. Well, we should just give a first and a third for this guy, and he'd fix our wide receiver room kind of thing. Well, there's nobody who's worth a first and a third of veteran players, pretty much. And you want the 30th best wide receiver in the league for that kind of thing. It's the same problem with the Orioles now have a ton of prospects. Everybody thinks if we don't take this chance to trade every one of them, or to trade most of them, or to trade at least some of them to get the talent to take them over the top.
It's all about the windows, but I think you and I agree on this. I think because we've talked about it before, there is so much luck / one play, 2 plays. I know baseball is a 7-game series, but a team. Yeah. So many of these teams that have come out of nowhere to win each year, right? Basketball may be a little bit more predictable, I think, in terms of just the NBA, and you normally see the top 2 or 3 seeds win, but no way in football, right? They win, but the point being is that the playoff run is filled with plays that have nothing to do with your talent. Sometimes it just has to do with a few plays here or there, and I don't think you carve up your assets, your future necessarily immediately just for that window, because it's not really about that. But yeah, I'm with you for the most part, I think.
I'm glad to hear that. As a season ticket holder, I want level, get me in the tournament, get me lottery tickets every year on being in the postseason, but don't ever mortgage my future, and don't ever create, forced rebuilds on the fly here because you think you really have a better chance to win this year. You're almost always overjudging. Yeah. And thankfully, the Ravens have not really done that.
If you just look at, if you even just look at 2019, I think what's lost in that season is that, people thought they would. Oh,
we're still good here. We might have lost Dev. Well, that's okay. We're going to say goodbye to Dev at this point. I'll just finish up here. Other folks out there, if you'd like to be on a film study short, hit me up on Twitter. DMs are always open. If you have an idea for a show, I'd love to hear from you, and I'll get back to you very quickly. Thanks again, Dev, for coming on. Always a wonderful friend, and glad to see him again, get a chance to talk to him. You probably get a sense of just how much we enjoy talking football together from this episode, and I hope anyway that shines pretty clearly. We'll talk to you next time on Film Study.